Sorry about that. I was interrupted by a phone call. So, again, we're going to talk about Boaz in this last portion of the lecture today. Franz Boas, who lived late 1800s or was born in 1858 and died in 1942, was a major figure and, in fact, considered to be the founding figure of American cultural anthropology. Do you remember from the podcast what his contribution was to the field? The culture concept, the idea of culture, right? Today, to us, that sounds obvious that there are different cultures out there in the world. But previously, prior to Boaz, it would have been talked about as different kinds of people, different races, different ethnic groups, with the assumption being that those people are inherently that the way that they are, they act that way, they do those things because of their race, but not because of their culture. So the culture concept developed by Boas and his students really counteracted racist notions of biological essentialism. In other words, that people are the way they are because of their biology, for example. By culture versus culture, with a capital C versus lower c, I mean, again, prior to Boaz, culture would have been used to refer to like someone who is cultured, someone who, say, goes to the opera, right? Which is really a classist way of saying, right, high culture. But again, what Boaz argued is that no, there are many different cultures out there in the world, and they all develop or merge simply because of the consequence of various historical events and geography, right? Inuit cultures developed the way that they did, in part because of the harsh Arctic conditions in which they survived, right? So this is what I mean by historical particularism, that individual cultures will look the way they do because of, of the histories in which they emerge. Boaz was Jewish and, of course, living at a time of great anti-Semitism. And he was very much influenced, undoubtedly, by the fact that he himself experienced racism as a Jewish scholar. And so, again, what's really important to note here is that according to the culture concept, differences between human communities were understood to be due to differences in social norms, in what we call cultural enculturation, the way children are raised in those particular societies, but not due to some innate biological difference, right? Again, nowadays, we take it for granted that we think of the world as having different um, cultures. This quote is taken straight from the podcast. Truths are partial and associated with their cultural context, right? That you understand the world in the way that you do, in part based on your culture. So Boas is a fascinating person. He gets his PhD in the 1800s and 1880s in physics in Germany. Um, his dissertation is titled Contributions to the Perception of the Color of Water. Right. So again, this is in physics. So you can see already early on, he's really interested in the concept of perception, how we perceive the world. He would then kind of change paths and go off to Baffin Island in Canada to work with indigenous communities there to complete ethnographic fieldwork in that part of the world in 1883 and into 1884. So by that time, he already had a PhD in physics, and he would go on to then actually become a professor of anthropology at Columbia in New York City. So again, to give you a sense of the timeline here, the late 1800s to, let you see, 1893 to 1939. Over in Europe, we have Malinowski, who's creating this method called participant observation. In the US, we have Franz Boas, who's emerging and in part creates this four-field tradition within American cultural anthropology. We will go on in future lectures and assignments to look at other aspects and legacies of Franz Boas' work, but I do want to very briefly note two of his students here, Zora Neale Hurston on the left, right? And again, I've mentioned her before in this course. American novelist, folklorist, and anthropologist, as well as Margaret Mead, who was an important figure in American cultural anthropology. All right, folks, that's it for today. Thanks for listening.